From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Is the state competition to cut taxes turning into a virtuous cycle? Plus, what to look for as President Biden prepares to give his State of the Union address tonight. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. The turn of the calendar last month to 2023 means that state lawmakers have been pre-filing bills and preparing for their coming legislative sessions. And they typically include some tax cut proposals. That's no surprise this year. Last year, Georgia, Iowa, Mississippi, and Arizona joined states that are on some sort of path to a flat rate income tax. And the Journal had an editorial on this trend recently called the State Tax Cut Movement. The line that stuck out to me says this: by year end, nearly half of all states will have cut their income tax rates within a 3-year period, unquote. Mene, I wonder if you could tell us where to look for this year's policy fights over taxes, and what do you suppose is driving this overall trend?
Absolutely. So to your first question, it seems as if there are promising proposals to cut taxes in at least 6 states. And that includes states like Arkansas, which has a new governor, Sarah Sanders, who campaigned on cutting taxes. Same thing for Nebraska, has an incoming governor who won in significant part due to his promise to reduce the cost of living in that state. So those are a couple. Same thing, Virginia and West Virginia are also mulling fairly significant cuts. Both of the governors there have to contend with their legislators, but it seems as if they're likely to come out of the budgeting season with some success. And so the movement is continuing. As you said, by year end, it's very likely that about half of states in the U.S. will have reduced their rates on income taxes just within the past 3 or so years. So this pace of tax cutting at the state level is really unprecedented. And there are a couple reasons for it. One of them is a pretty wide revenue boom that has occurred in nearly every state in the wake of the pandemic shutdowns. So as you'll recall, there was a big stock market run-up, which led to higher capital gains tax collections. And generally, states ended up very flush with revenue compared with previous years. And so a lot of governors who wanted to reduce tax rates finally found that they had breathing room to reduce them. But another one is competition, and that's what gets to the snowball effect. Americans are more mobile in recent years. You have a lot of people who are moving, and people who do move often will cite the high cost of living in their previous homes as one of the reasons for moving. And so states really know that not only for ordinary citizens, but particularly for their wealthiest ones who are paying the bulk of the tax burden, if they want to attract people and sustain their tax base, they're going to have low rates to attract potential movers.
And that competition is what turns this into a virtuous circle. And the editorial quotes the president of the Utah Taxpayers Association saying, "We were the cool kid on the block 15 years ago when we moved to a 5% flat tax. We're no longer the cool kid on the block at all." And he explains that in the past few years, Colorado has adopted a 4.4% top rate on income, and Arizona is moving to a 2.5% rate. And so, Kim, I think there are a lot of governors in these red or even these purple states who see this as a competition and who know that there are residents who are either eyeing states like Florida with no income tax at all, or who live close enough to a border. Sometimes it's a road, state line road. Sometimes it is named, and they can pick which side of that to live on. And if they're trying to build a record as a successful governor and a successful state, this is a competition that they can't afford to sit out.
One of the things that holds together some of those 6 states that Mene was talking about that are now set to cut taxes is that most of them are near a state that did cut taxes. And so suddenly the ability for people to move across those state lines, as you mentioned, is much bigger. And the other thing that I think is interesting is that competition is not turning out to be a one and done. But many of these states, this is their second round of tax cuts because they're continuing continuing to try to compete. So, for instance, in Arkansas, the former governor there, Asa Hutchinson, dropped the top rate from 5.5 to 4.9. Now, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the incoming governor, she hasn't exactly laid out her proposal in detail, but she has very grand ambitions to attempt to phase out that income tax altogether. Similarly, Nebraska, the former governor Pete Ricketts had dropped the top rate from 6.84 to 5.84. Now, the new governor is looking to potentially bring up a bill that would get it down to closer to 4. And, if you look at the literature and some of the things that Nebraska legislatures have pointed out, is that right now they're ranked 35th in terms of their tax situation and competitiveness. And that's simply not good enough when there are so many other places you can go to. And the one other thing I would add to the very good points that Monet made about why this is happening is not just surpluses out there and not just the drive of competition, but COVID really did change the way people looked at things. And suddenly people realized that when they were staying home, that there was a lot more opportunity to live and work in different places. And I think that's driving the migration too.
But Monet, you mentioned that some of this trend involves pandemic changes. So not only federal COVID aid that came in, but also the reopening of the economy, rising stock prices, and capital gains. And so, how are these governors rebutting the argument that they're going to cut the tax rates? And then, once the pandemic aid is gone, once we have a correction perhaps in stock prices, there's going to be a revenue bust. And often the example that you hear raised is a set of Kansas tax cuts that passed in 2012. So, how are these governors trying to deal with that critique or avoid that problem?
Well, the first answer to that question is through revenue modeling. Every single one of these states has a revenue department that has in house economists who are doing projections, and they tend to have a fairly accurate sense of what is the trend that we're on, what are the sources of the revenue increases, what are our projected costs. And by doing that, they're able to determine what is the comfortable rate that we can reduce taxes at. It's worth pointing out that quite a lot of these states that have reduced their taxes also have contained spending within the same period. So they're trying very hard to not just depend on the short term revenue uptick, but also to restructure state finances in a way that will make sure that they always stay in the black. But it's also worth pointing out that a lot of the states that don't reduce their tax rates in the event of a surplus will end up spending it on record budgets. So that's what you saw in places like California and New York. They had the same surplus in the wake of the pandemic, but they're not going to sit on it. No state is simply going to sit on a surplus of that kind. And so they end up committing it to spending. And then California has found itself with a massive shortfall. So often the decision is between cutting taxes or increasing spending. And tax cutting has, over the past couple years, shown itself to be the much more responsible choice in terms of the way that the revenues have sustained over time.
Not every state is following this tax cutting trend. However, there are several blue states that seem to be doubling down on their model of governance. One is Massachusetts. It used to have a flat 5% income tax rate. Then there was a referendum that changed that. Now the top rate there is 9%. And Kim, of course, there is New York. And last week, Governor Hochul gave an address and laid out her proposed policies. They include a statewide carbon trading system that would be a de facto tax increase on businesses, and then also an increase in the payroll tax from 0.34% to 0.5%. And that money would help bail out the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which runs the subways and has struggled with lost ridership and subway crime and so forth. And Kim, I mean, what do you make of this divergence between the trends that I think red and even some purple states are following here on taxes? I mean, I mentioned Colorado earlier, and then some of these deep blue states that seem to see, at least in my view, no limit on the tax increases that they can add on people, though. I mean, we've discussed in previous podcasts, and there's a lot of news reporting on the numbers of residents that are fleeing those states.
It's so striking. And that's what makes it so remarkable that they are not stopping to think about this. I mean, New York politicians have been having an open discussion about the problem of wealthier Americans leaving their states because their current tax codes are so progressive and they depend so highly on high income Americans that when you have significant numbers of them flee to another place, you suddenly can have giant budget holes. And yet it doesn't seem to be stopping them. The Hochul proposal is notable in that it's actually somewhat regressive in terms of the payroll taxes, but also the CO2 cap and trade program, which is essentially a stealth tax because what they're going to do is basically auction off allowances to fuel distributors and utilities and manufacturers in the state, but they're going to become increasingly more expensive to buy. And that's going to get passed on to every single consumer in the state, every single business in the state. It's going to make things much more expensive, much more costly. It's going to further encourage that out migration. But the fact that this is such a stealthy and regressive tax almost seems to be an admission by New York that it cannot fund all of its ambitions simply by imposing capital gains and millionaires taxes on millionaires, especially because many of them are leaving, that this pain is going to have to be borne by the entire tax-paying public and in really excruciating ways. And this is what you're starting to see out in places like California and elsewhere. So you still have these states definitely out there saying, we're going to go after the billionaires and the wealthy people. But there's beginning to be an admission that there are fewer of those people living there. They're all in Florida, and that the average taxpayer is going to have to start floating these ridiculous ambitions.
Not that those states don't want to do the millionaires' taxes too, because they definitely do. And there was a notable movement last month. 8 states unveiled plans to target wealthy residents in coordination. They include California, New York, Illinois, Maryland, Hawaii, Minnesota, Connecticut, and Washington state. And these plans differ in their details. So in Illinois, the idea is to treat unrealized capital gains as income at a tax rate of about 5%. In New York, it would be a surtax on income and very large ones, a surtax total of 15% on top earners. And the notable thing about this to me is the message seems to be that we're going to act in coordination in order to try to limit the problem of residents fleeing. One state representative in Illinois explicitly said, "We want to send a message that there is nowhere to hide," unquote. And Monet, I thought that was a remarkable moment. These states all moving to act together, and who knows whether any of this legislation will get close to passage and a governor's signature in order to be implemented in reality. But the idea that the way progressives are going to solve this problem is by taxing all at the same time and raising their rates all at the same time. So, if you're choosing between New York and California as where you make your home base, it's not going to be much of a choice at all for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it does make a certain degree of sense within the already distorted progressive logic on taxation, which is that in the same way that people are making their decision about where to live based on low taxes, the fear of losing population is one thing that has put a little bit of restraint, and I say a little, on blue states that have sought to keep their taxes increasing. And so no state wants to be the first mover when it comes to creating a groundbreaking new tax like a wealth tax. And the idea is we can take some of the cost to each state away if we have a few that are all moving at the same time and reducing the number of potential exits for residents. But as you suggested, there are at least 25, 30, 35 even red or purple states that certainly have no intention of passing massive wealth taxes, which will be potential destinations for people fleeing any of these states that do decide to impose very, very high rates on their top earners. But as you implied also, the good news is that most of these proposals are very unlikely to come into law. They're proposed by very progressive members of the legislature who are working in very close conjunction with the teachers' unions. And for that reason, they're always searching for what's the new frontier of revenue that we can open up to make sure that salaries and pensions are funded. They want to signal to their progressive base that we're taking the fight to the rich and fighting to get even more of the fair share for state revenues. But there generally has been very little support for either explicit wealth taxes or some of the large taxes on millionaires or capital gains at the very high levels that were introduced as part of this state alliance.